Apostolic Teams International. Welcome. It is May 19th. Welcome to this month's Zoom call dialogue. Every third week of the month, we release a video teaching. And then every fourth Tuesday of the month, we jump on a Zoom call together where we can dive into that conversation and dialogue. And it's always just a rich time. And this year has been tremendous as we've been on this topic of God is building a person, not a platform. And we've walked through multiple topics, starting with personal wholeness as Glenn opened us up, and then moving into, or starting with personal holiness, and then we moved into personal wholeness and maturity. Jeff and Lene came through with family and marital health. Last month, we actually did strong in doctrine. And now we're kind of concluding the conversation with this topic of strong in prayer. And those two things, of course, are married together, that as leaders, as God is building a person, as he's building me and not a platform, we have a desire to see spiritual leaders grow, to be strong in doctrine and strong in prayer. And I believe, particularly on the conversation of prayer, I can't express the timeliness of this conversation in the church, not just ATI and where we are, but I believe particularly in the West that Jesus is having a fresh conversation and will with the spiritual leaders of our generation concerning the priorities of the kingdom, particularly the priority of prayer and the need for prayer in our generation. It is 2023, so January 1st, 2020, before COVID, before the world changed. I was a part of a solemn assembly in Tulsa, a gathering of believers just hungry to hear what is Jesus saying to his church as we move into the next decade. I had the privilege of speaking on January 1st, and the word the Lord would have me to deliver was this. He said, I'm getting ready to declutter my church that Christ may become visible again. And then he said that what is most important to me will again become what is most important to you. And we see in Acts how the church was inaugurated in Acts chapters 1 and 2. And just the beginnings were really simple. They didn't have all of the stuff that we have to manage. It was a passion. It was a group of people who were madly in love with Jesus and were willing to die for him, for his mission, and die for one another. They laid down their life. They didn't have all the media and the administration and the facilities and the programs that we have. So it was very simple beginnings. And then through time, I believe that we've kind of become hoarders through time, holding on to things and programs and that's important for us to know, because where there is clutter, many times there is mixed priorities. And out of that prophetic word, I really believe that the Lord was saying, I'm getting ready to, over this next decade, have a conversation with my church about priorities. And I believe that we are in a time as spiritual leaders where there is a need for us to fight for the priorities of the kingdom, because the priorities of the kingdom have been hijacked by culture. What are the priorities of the kingdom? Not what culture says, not what we see working, not the methods that we see working, but what has Jesus called his spiritual leaders and what has Jesus called his church to prioritize as we function as the church in our generation. And so, as we're talking about priorities, you would really think in our generation, in order to have an impactful ministry, that it's more important to have a good social media platform and good photos and good content on there, rather than to live on your face before the Lord. And there's a challenge of what's important right now. And the reality is that social media and strategies and methods don't build generational legacy. God does. How do we know? Because he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they did not have all that we have. They didn't have a social media platform. I think of the leaders that have gone before us, like Oral Roberts and Jonathan Edwards and A.W. Tozer, and that every generation will know them and feel the impact of their lives. And they did not have social media. Why? Well, because they lived their life on their face before God. It was the earmark of their life and their ministry. And I want to talk about this first segment of conversation, which is a return to the call, our highest priority. Prayer is less at the forefront. If we were to be aware and observe, it's less at the forefront of the call of spiritual leadership in our generation. That's because of the nature and the culture of the contemporary church. There is less of a demand to pray, and there's really less of a demand for the supernatural power of God and more of a demand for everything else. And we have to be aware of that as leaders, because demands test and reveal our priorities. Demands test and reveal our priorities. And I'm so grateful for Acts, and particularly Acts chapter 6 in this conversation, as we see this is a time where the church is growing, the church is expanding, and church growth means that there's a growth in demand. So as the demands begin to increase, really for the first time, I'm so glad that we get an inside look at how they navigated that. In Acts chapter 6, you guys know it. Now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, "It is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables." The demand increases. We have to look at what was their response. It's in verse 4 where it says, "But we will," here was their response, "but we will devote ourselves to prayer and the ministry of the word." It's the two last month's topics combined into one statement to be strong. We're going to devote ourselves to be strong in doctrine and strong in prayer. We really are in a generation where we have social media gurus and administrative masters and charismatic speakers and church growth analysts leading the church. But when the shaking happens, it will reveal where the power is. And his power is only where his presence is, and his presence is where there are voices crying to heaven, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in this place as it is in heaven." That there's a demand from earth on heaven saying, "We need your presence. We need your power." Here's the question that I want to ask. What do we think would have happened if prayer in Acts chapter 6 was not their priority? Because again, demands test and reveal our priorities. It was a test to their priorities, but it also revealed the priorities that was in the heart of the church during that particular time. But what would have happened if they just kind of got busy, kind of like we are nowadays, and they just had to set up offices, and they just kind of got busy, and they just leaned into the demands of the growing church? What would have happened? I'm convinced that apart from the sovereignty of God, we would maybe have not have heard the gospel here in Claremore. Why? Because a supernatural mission really does require supernatural power, and supernatural power requires an exchange between heaven and earth, and that avenue of exchange God has created to be the place of prayer. If they would not have prioritized to say, "We are going to devote ourselves to our highest priority," and that is to be strong in doctrine and be strong in prayer, I believe persecution would have shut them out. We see when persecution began to hit the church, prayer was their response, because any type of demand tests and reveals our priorities. And so prayer was their priority, and it was revealed in that moment that as persecution was coming against the church, they knew one thing, and they gathered and they lifted their voices to heaven and said, "Oh, sovereign God, you see. You see the threats." And they began to cry out to heaven for boldness and for supernatural power. They were aware that our ability we've reached the end of our own ability to carry out this mission. We've reached the end of our own strength. We are in need of supernatural empowerment. And the Bible says that heaven responded to the prayer in a tangible way. The place began to shake and something happened, that they received a spiritual impartation, listen, that they did not have before that moment of intercession. It's the power of prayer. There was an impartation that gave them a boldness to do that which the Lord had called them to do. And so demands are going to increase amongst us as spiritual leaders, but we must determine what is most important. I look back and I think back of the generations of spiritual leaders that have gone before us, and I've always been so inspired by their lives of prayer and intercession, their draw to the presence of God. It was, the earmark of their strength, whether biblically or more recently, the earmark of their lives was not their strength, their wisdom. They were very, very flawed. I love that the Bible reveals their flaws. So therefore, what was the earmark that set them apart in their generation? It was this, that they are all dependent on Him. They were 100% dependent upon the Lord, and the fruit of that dependency was a life of prayer. I'm telling you, you see it as the earmark of every major leader in every generation. We look at Abraham. His life was marked by relational intimacy with the Lord, to the extent that God is sending judgment and he is in intercession. He's in relational conversation saying, God, don't kill me, but what if there's 20 that are righteous? Oh, okay, what if there's 15? Okay, give me mercy. What if there's 10? He's having this dialogue. We see this life that was marked by prayer in the life of Abraham. You can go on and on. You look at Moses. It's in Exodus chapter 33 where Moses says, if your presence doesn't go up with us, then don't send us from this place. The earmark of his life was total dependency. Lord, if you don't go, we're not going either. We are in desperate need of your presence, and we refuse to do anything apart from your presence. We look at the life of David, where the Bible explicitly gives us visual understanding of his flaws. But yet, you look at the life of David, and it was his devotional life that has become a model for generations. When I think of David, I'm not necessarily inspired by his kingship or even his battle tactics. Like I'm not a warrior. I'm not in battle. So what about David have I always been drawn to? It's always been that he's a lover of God, that he's a man after God's own heart. I've always been inspired by how deeply he loved the Lord and how drawn he was to the presence of the Lord, even as a young boy in the places of worship. He carried such a power and presence about him that he would play an instrument and demons would leave Saul. I mean, I was always drawn to that, and we see it throughout his life, and we see it in the Psalms. Here's an example in Psalm 109. The Psalms are loaded with examples of it, but this is in particular, I want to show this because it shows that this was his priority and this was his response. And in Psalm 109, he says, "For wicked and deceitful mouths are opened against me, speaking against me with lying tongues. They encircle me with words of hate and attack me without cause. In return for my love, they accuse me." But don't miss this. "But I give myself to prayer." I think of Elijah, how immersed he was in the realm of the Spirit, how aligned he was in constant communion with heaven. There's this example that the king of Syria came to Elijah and basically, make a long story short, surrounded the city with horses and with chariots. But listen to his words, 2 Kings 6, verse 16. He said, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Then Elijah prayed. His life was marked by prayer. He prayed and said, "Oh Lord, please open his eyes," speaking of his servant, "that he may see." So the Lord opened his eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elijah. So Elijah's walking in a realm and a dimension where he is so aware of the supernatural. He's so aware of the presence of God. He's so aware of the strength of God. And it says, and when the Syrians came down against him, now understand, he's already seen how much help from heaven is surrounding them. And yet, it says, when the chariots came down against him, Elijah prayed to the Lord and said, please strike this people with blindness. Now, we read this and it seems like it's just a statement, but we have to understand it as prayer. He's in intercession saying, Lord, would you come? We are in need of your power. Listen, so he struck them with blindness. Here's what's important. In accordance with the prayer of Elijah. That's why James comes in James chapter 5, verse 16, and he alludes to Elijah in this part where he says, therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. And then he says in verse 17, Elijah was a man with a nature just like ours. He's trying to get us to understand it wasn't nothing special about Elijah. It was the power of prayer and intercession. He was a man with a nature just like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. I'm reflecting, those are biblical leaders, but as you look in the generations of leaders that have gone before us, there's this earmark, and it was always this earmark of a life laid your face before the Lord in prayer and intercession, a life given to the place of prayer. Martin Luther, we know about him. He prayed multiple hours a day. And I want to go through a few of these, not for us to say, oh man, I need to pray like that. No. That's not what we're doing at all. It's just to see, Lord, what has been the priority? What has been the highest priority of the spiritual leaders who have gone before us, who have made major impartations in the earth and into the church. So Martin Luther, he quotes this: if I fail to spend 2 hours in prayer each morning, the devil gets the victory through the day. I have so much business I cannot get on without spending hours daily in prayer. And again, this is not us saying we want to do that. It's just saying, Lord, what was the priority of their lives? What was immovable to them? That he says, I have so much business that I can't help but spend multiple hours in prayer because of all the business that I had to do. And now we're kind of pulled from the place of prayer because of all the business that we have to do. But that drove them to prayer, not away from prayer. John Wesley prayed, as we know, multiple hours per day. George Whitefield prayed at least 3 hours a day in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening. We know that he was a great evangelist in England and in America. E.M. Bounds, one of my favorite writers on prayer, he prayed 3 hours daily. He prayed daily for 3 hours before he would begin work on his writings. And we know that his writings have been some of the most powerful books ever written. More recent, David Yonggi Cho, the pastor of the largest church in the world, we know about his life of prayer, that he would early in his life, he would give 4 to 5 hours a day dedicated to the place of prayer. John Piper, I want to read this. This was when he was speaking at the ordination of Glenn Bloomstrom. He said, to be very specific, Glenn, so that you will remember it, almost no minister of the gospel will be a spiritually fruitful person if he is spending less than a couple of hours a day in prayer and meditation in addition to his sermon preparation. He says, holy, powerful, life-changing spiritual men of God are not made on the run. There are so few people who believe that, Glenn, that the expectations laid on you in the service will probably be a constant threat to your spiritual power and fruitfulness. But Christ has appointed you to go and bear fruit. So resist those expectations with boldness. And then, of course, we have our greatest example, Jesus himself. As we look at his life, we say, what did his life look like? What was his priorities while he was on earth? Hebrews 5:7 says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cry. This is what he was here doing, right? He's offering up prayers and supplication with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. How about Matthew 14:23? It says, after he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. How about Luke 16:12? It was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. How about Mark 1:35? In the early morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went away to a secluded place and was praying there. On and on. And this is what the disciples were observing. This is the model that they received. So therefore, when Jesus ascended, it was obviously their priority because it was his priority. It was the earmark of their life. And they were able to connect the power that he walked in publicly with the devotion that he had private. Revealer. Prayer is a revealer. And more than anything, it reveals our dependencies. Dependency on the Lord in the Spirit will always manifest itself as prayer in the natural. It's true. And I believe that the root of prayer is need. More specifically, an awareness of our need. The root of prayer is an awareness of our need. The more that I am aware of my desperate need for him, the more that I will be drawn to the place of prayer, because that is the only place of exchange where his strength is imparted to me and I can walk in his spiritual strength. So the root of prayer is an awareness of need. Prayer really does proclaim. It's not a task. For me, it's a statement. It proclaims, Lord, I am in need of you. Lord, I cannot do this without you. I am desperately in need of you. Therefore, I believe that the root of prayerlessness is not busyness, right? That's what we think. I don't pray because I don't have the time. I would say the root of prayerlessness is pride and self-sufficiency, right? That somewhere along the way, I have started to believe that I can do this without you. That's at the root of prayerlessness, of we don't really need you. And I believe that the church in the West is right there in that space where there's much prayerlessness in the church in the West, but I believe it points back to our self-sufficiency. Why is the power of God flowing in Africa more than here? Why is the power of God flowing in other places more than here? I would suggest that it's they have less to lean on. They have less to depend on. They don't have an urgent care on every corner. They are in need of the power of God. And when you are in a place of dependency, the fruit of dependency is always going to be prayer. But in the West, we have so many other things to lean on. We have our structure, we have our social media, and we have our lights, and we have our stage. And without realizing it, we've not realized how self-sufficient we have become. And the revealer of that self-sufficiency is our prayerlessness. There's three final thoughts that I want to give. I want to talk just the prerequisite of prayer, and then the posture of prayer, and then the process of prayer. And then we'll pray and get ready for our Zoom conversation. What is the prerequisite of prayer? In light of what we said, the prerequisite of prayer is this word. It really is humility. It goes first. One cannot step into a prayer life apart from humility. Jesus comes in the Beatitudes and says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's the first one he gave because it really is the entry point to the kingdom. Blessed are those who are bankrupt in their spirit. Blessed are those who stand before God and say, Lord, I have literally nothing to offer. I am bankrupt. I don't have anything to offer. I don't have anything to give. That's the foundation of our salvation is, Lord, I am lost. I am broken and I have nothing to offer. And we think about when our soul is humbled, the question is, where do we go? And the answer is, we go to prayer every single time. When our soul is humbled by whatever God uses, he humbles our soul and we're drawn back to the place of prayer. Why? Because brokenness always produces dependency, and dependency always leads us to the place of prayer. Number two, the posture of prayer. If the prerequisite of prayer is humility, the posture of prayer is dependency. Humility will always produce dependency. We say, well, I just need more discipline to pray. And I would say you don't need more discipline to pray, because you don't need discipline to eat. You eat out of hunger. When you are desperate for something, discipline becomes irrelevant. I go about my day and I can start to feel, oh my God, I'm getting hangry. I'm starting to feel my body is breaking down. I am in need of food. There's no discipline. There's no schedule. No one's saying, I've been so busy, I haven't eaten in 12 days. No one says that, because discipline is not needed where there is dependency. And I would say dependency produces discipline, but it begins with a dependency and a hunger and a desperation. Dependency is the posture of prayer. Lastly, what is the process of prayer? And many times this is where we get hung up. And I believe that we focus too much on this part, the process of prayer. How do we pray? What do we say? How long? All of that is actually irrelevant, because prayer is not a task, it's a place. No one is getting ready to move into a new house and says, wait a minute, before we move in, what are we going to do when we get in there? Right? What are we going to do? No one even, you're going to live when you get in there. You're just going to live life. And if we see prayer less as a task and more as a place we're called to live and dwell, it becomes easy. Here's the process of prayer. The process of prayer is fellowship. That's it. I'm going to dwell in the presence of my King. I'm going to spend time with him in fellowship, in relationship. I'm coming into the house, and I want to give you an invitation to come deeper into the place of prayer, to dwell there in the place of fellowship. As we close, I'm thinking about where we are as a church in our generation, and the priorities of the kingdom being confused, and the Lord saying in that word that he's going to declutter his church, that what is most important to him will again become what is most important to us. And I just reflect on where we are. It really is nowadays, the average pastor would feel guilty if he took one whole day in a week, one whole day from start to finish, and gave himself to prayer and intercession. I mean, the reality is the average pastor would feel the guilt of that because of the organizational things that we're letting down, and the people that we're letting down, and the expectation we're letting down. But if the first century apostles time traveled to now and interviewed us, and we let them know, hey, in our generation, pastors give one day of prayer a week to pray, they'd probably laugh and say, only one day? How in the world are you advancing the kingdom if your spiritual leaders are only given one day in prayer? Little do they know, most of us spiritual leaders and pastors can hardly find one day a week to set aside in prayer. And that's why I believe that this is where we are, the timeliness of this conversation, for us to step back as spiritual leaders and say, wait a minute, where is our dependencies? Have we become self-sufficient? What are the priorities of the kingdom? And that us as spiritual leaders, we would bring being strong in doctrine and strong in prayer back to the forefront, back to our highest priority to our generation, because they function in a completely different paradigm. Elijah would have been the worst staff member in the world. He would have always been in the wilderness. Like, where is Elijah? Somebody go get Elijah, right? Because they were drawn to the presence of God, because they understood that they carried a responsibility to hear from heaven for their generation. And I want to say to us that we don't have the responsibility just to build strong organizations. No. We have a responsibility to hear from heaven for our generation. Paul cannot do that for us. Moses cannot. We are the ones responsible. And I don't know about you, I desire to hear afresh from heaven. So Father, we just thank you for this opportunity, for the draw of your Spirit to draw us deeper. And I pray just over as we gather.